Welcome to the Language Fuel podcast. Our mission is to fuel the teaching and learning of languages worldwide. I'm your host, Joanna Smith. Welcome to the Language Fuel podcast, episode number 14. And Happy New Year as I am about to publish this. It is early January 2017. So some of you might be tuning in because you're making New Year's resolutions about learning a new language. And if so, this is the episode for you. Today we're introducing Leslie Foster. Leslie and I go way back, more than a decade. We have taught together and gone on holiday together and worked very well together. And Leslie is a language coach. One of the ways she spends her time is coaching people in their efforts at self-directed language learners. And if you're wondering what that's all about, listen to the podcast and she will explain all about that. And I'm very excited because Leslie is going to work with us at Language Fuel to continue these efforts. So if after you've had a listen to what she has to say, you're very keen to work with Leslie and help her to coach you in your desire to learn a new language, you're very welcome to hop on the website and connect with her that way. I hope you enjoy the interview and I hope you learn a whole bunch about what self-directed language learning is. So today we're talking to Leslie Foster. Welcome, Leslie.
Welcome. Nice to be here.
Leslie, you are a self-directed language coach or a language coach for self-directed learners. And, you know, before there's so many things that I could ask you about, but I guess the real basics that we need to talk about today are what exactly is a self-directed learner? How would you define that and what you work with, the types of people that you work with?
Okay. Well, actually, all adults in some ways and forms are self-directed learners. Self-directed learners keep learning without being told to do it by someone on the outside. They have an internal motivation. And but for most adults, they only want to do learning in the areas that they're interested in. And sometimes they tell themselves that they are interested in learning a language, but then when they don't do anything about it or nothing really productive, then it could just be lip service.
And I'm sure that happens quite a lot. People say, oh, I'd like to do this and I'd like to do that, but then nothing actually happens.
That's right. And I think part of being an adult is learning to do the things that you know you need to do. Basically, self-directed learners ask themselves questions in three ways. They ask themselves how to learn. In other words, how do they need to learn? How do they manage their learning process? They actually also manage their motivation and their long-term goals, and they ask the question themselves, why am I learning this? And then also the last question is they make choices for the content or what are they going to learn. So, you know, say you get a new smartphone and it's slightly different. I mean, generally speaking, people have a real desire to learn how to use the thing. And so they'll figure out what they need to learn. They'll know why they're learning it so they can do all sorts of things. And they'll even figure out how to learn it. Now, the big question is that most people need to deal with is how self-directed am I? Often people who are used to being told what to do are quite dependent, and they look for some authority figure to tell them exactly how to learn. And they look for direction from some sort of leader. And often the leader is just doing one-way communication, you know, just giving directives. And that's where a lot of people can be in a lot of ways. But other times, if they are more interested and involved, then they see these authority figures as people who can help them facilitate their learning and maybe point them in the right direction. But don't tell them exactly everything to do.
Mm. So
Um,
if I just interrupt you for a minute, so somebody who might be used to, I guess I want to sort of use the word institutionalized or something like that, somebody who might be used to learning in an institution or in a classroom, that's okay, isn't it? I mean, if they find a classroom that is meeting their needs, then that's perfectly good. But I guess there's probably a ton more learners who know or realize they need something a bit more than that or different from their institutional learning or the classroom environment. Or maybe they can't find a classroom environment, so they need to be self-directed. Is that sort of what you're saying?
yeah, I'm
Mm.
not saying that self-directed learners don't go and take
Hmm.
formal learning in an institution,
Okay.
but they realize that that is only one resource, and they
Hmm.
do not delegate the
Hmm.
responsibility for learning to the teacher.
Hmm.
They use the teacher as a resource to provide them direction for them to
Hmm.
continue their own learning.
Right. So it's really what I'm hearing you say is there's a huge amount of basically taking ownership of their own learning process and taking responsibility for what happens, whether it's within or without the classroom, or any formal training that they might be receiving.
Yes, that's right. So,
Mm.
self-direction, as one author puts it, Henry Holick, it's the critical ability to reflect on one's own experience and to take charge of one's own learning.
Mm.
And John Trim says an adapted ability allowing learners to develop supportive structures around themselves. So
Mm.
a self-directed learner will find the way to go about learning
Hmm.
whether or not they're told to do it
Yeah.
because they have this internal motivation.
Mm. It's very interesting, and you mentioned right at the very beginning something. All adults are in some shape or form self-directed. Part of me sort of then actually thought of the idea, well, actually, children learn automatically whether or not they are conscious of their motivation. If a child who is still developing their native language ability too, or a second language ability, if they're surrounded in the right environment, they actually will naturally learn, but they may not be conscious of their learning process. Whereas I think for an adult, it doesn't come so naturally. If they've already established their first language, really deeply, they would probably have to be a little bit more conscious about making an effort to learn. Mm.
Absolutely. Actually, everybody does learn unconsciously, but the
Mm.
rate of learning as an adult slows down.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
And when you already have a lot in your brain, you tend to go to those areas that you're already comfortable with.
Mm. Yeah.
So it
Yeah.
does take intentional, focused learning to keep adding.
Yeah. And when I like what you talked about earlier about self-directed learning being the how, the why, and the what, sometimes I guess the how, people might not actually know necessarily how without a little bit of outside help with some ideas that they might like to try.
That's
Um,
right. And that's where the language coach comes in.
mhm. So tell us a little bit about you being a language coach. How long have you been doing this type of coaching? And can you give us some examples of the types of ways that you interact with your self-directed learners?
Yes, I sure can. Well, I started out just really as a teacher, teaching on courses here in New Zealand and in various places overseas for people who were before they got to a field situation where they were actually immersed in learning their language. I provided them with a course, and I still do this course,
Hmm.
where I kind of help them to see what's actually involved in language learning, and I provide learner training, helping people to become better learners,
Mm.
to become more focused on the learning process, to learn to ask the questions, how to learn, why should they learn, and what to learn.
Mm.
And I've been involved in helping learners develop their own skills and
Mm.
having intentional language and culture learning. And actually what they need to learn is develop these skills as a lifestyle,
Hmm.
okay? Because language learning continues on whether you're focused on it or not. And if you develop good habits early on, you will continue them.
Mm.
You may not be adding so many words at once, but you keep working on it.
Yeah, and I
And
think that if I just interrupt really briefly, I think that's really important. I was, talking to someone in an earlier podcast episode who had lived in this second country for a very long time, and I think perhaps at the beginning of their journey hadn't necessarily set up really great language learning habits, and so they sort of found themselves many years down the track not being as fluent in that language as they had really hoped by then. So I can totally see what you're saying there about setting up those good patterns and behavioral habits as soon as you get to the new country so that it just kind of happens more naturally.
Well, in the last couple of years, I've been working with people who have maybe not done so at the beginning, but
Hmm.
they are frustrated and now they want to do that.
Hmm.
So I work with them to where they are and help them um, still develop their skills because it's not like something you can't
Hmm.
work on.
Sure.
And so what I try to do then is to provide the learner with a non-judgmental being a non-judgmental person and help them feel comfortable at sharing what's really going on and help them work their way forward
Hmm. Hmm.
so that they can start to climb the language mountain
Mm.
again.
Mm.
But
It,
it Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that's a very, very interesting metaphor, the language mountain, because there is a lot to learn in a language. I mean, people perhaps underestimate the skills required. Yeah, I see where you're coming from in that. The other thing that I was reflecting on is, yeah, obviously we're talking about language learning here, but the way that you approach this, I really admire, and it's almost like I'm thinking other things I see frequently on the internet, weight loss coaching or any other type of coaching in life that somebody needs, that non-judgmental, hey, you haven't reached your goals yet. Let's take a step back and figure out the how, the why, and the what. And, it's sort of a generic process that you think could apply to anything.
Well, one of the things is it is a huge ask. People who want to operate in their new language and culture as a fully formed, educated adult, as they are in their home culture, they don't realize all of what's involved. They think it may just be learning some new vocabulary and some grammar patterns, and maybe tone if they go to a tone language. But it's so much more than that. And they often get focused on the wrong things. And so that's why it's important that the coach build a relationship with the learner that inspires confidence, that that they can actually learn, that no matter where they've been, they can still learn, and they encourage them in planning and doing LACL activities that actually will help them meet their goals.
Mm-hmm.
Many times they try to do something at a level higher than they are.
Mm.
So they need to learn to recognize reality
Mm-hmm.
and they need to realize that they've got to crawl before they can walk or run.
Mm. Mm.
And it's not that they're going to stay crawling long, but if they don't put in some of the basics and really practice. And this is what I also find is people think that they're learning language when they just keep adding new things rather than consolidating what they already know and
Mm.
building fluency.
Right. Yeah, that's very, very interesting. So you talked about, crawling before you can run. Would you do some kind of diagnosis or analysis of where that language learner is along the journey? Do you have tools that help them recognize, I guess, certain stages that could be applied to the different languages people are learning?
Yes, it's very easy. There's lots of stuff freely out on the internet for
Mm-hmm.
that. Um, I really enjoy the can-do statements from the Canadian benchmarks. It's available on the Canada website for
Mm-hmm.
language learning. ACTFL also has some very good tools, and what's really nice about what they have is they have audio clips of learners from different languages showing the different stages,
Mm.
and that's quite good.
Mm.
And then I think the European framework is another one that is also quite good.
Mm.
So, yes, there's stuff out there and it's freely available. But what I find is that a lot of people don't know how to use it properly.
Right.
And so that's another area where the coach can really help them to find effective procedures.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that's really key is they need to learn to be able to reflect on their own progress in a way that will spur them to keep going on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And we try to help them with that.
So that motivational aspect, I guess if it is a long journey, it can be discouraging if one had unrealistic expectations about what the skill level might be by that point in time.
And that's a language myth that time in place or whatever is going to make you better.
Mm,
It's not, it has nothing to, time is a factor, but it is not really the major one.
mm,
Um,
mm,
a lot of people think, oh, if I just give 6 months to go into language school, I'll be fine. Or if I give a year or 2 years. But
mm,
time does help, but it is not the main factor.
mm. I guess people could be wasting their time on activities or things that aren't helping them necessarily.
That's right. And a lot of people do that. And
Mm,
so they do inappropriate strategies and activities.
mm, mm.
And what works at one stage does not necessarily work so well at a different stage. And the
Yeah.
other thing most people do not realize is that they need to be doing culture learning on
Mm,
top of it. Because if they take the new words and apply their cultural framework, 20 to 30 to maybe even 50% of the time, they may get it wrong.
mhm,
And there will not be real communication between the people if their
mm,
goal for language learning is communication.
mm. That's interesting. And just picking up on, comment, depending on what someone's goal is, do you find that you work with language learners who have quite different goals? Like some people may want to be able to have communication with native speakers, others may just want to, say, read in the target language, or others may simply want to, be able to watch the news where they're at, or something like that. I mean, do you get very, very specific goals like that, differing ones with your coachees?
Most of the coaches I work with want to develop what I want to call interactional communication skills.
Mm-hmm.
The transactional ones are actually the easiest. That's basically being able to buy something in the market or, get a taxi or
Mm-hmm.
something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But most of the people I want to work with want to develop relationships to, have friends.
Yep.
And that's a lot more. That is a much higher level of language, of being able to communicate in the language. And that's where it's really important to learn the social linguistic and the cultural cues, which could be quite different.
Mm.
Or even if they're not that different, they're still different enough that could create problems if they don't learn to reflect and recognize that there's a miscommunication.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. A lot of sense. And I remember talking with when I was an exchange student many, many years ago, and talking with other exchange students and reflecting on our language learning at that point. And we were all teenagers, so we probably learnt it relatively quickly, and we were, living with families in the country. And we reflected that says, as you said, that transactional stuff, we can ask for the milk to be passed down the table, and we know to say we're going to post a letter or whatever it was that we could do. But as soon as you hung out with friends and had to talk about your feelings and the
Mm,
the deeper meaningful things, that was the hardest. That sort of took a lot longer. And I suppose maybe because you don't do that as frequently, but also when your emotions start to become involved, somehow it kind of changes things. And I'm not sure how all that sort of works in the brain or whatever, but it is definitely a different kettle of fish. I can understand that.
yeah, but people don't realize all of what's involved in that. They think, oh, if I just keep learning new words, or if I just learn new grammatical patterns, and they're thinking too low a level. They're not
Mm,
thinking at how to tell a story.
mm,
So they may tell a story in the way that they would tell it in their home country, but it still wouldn't communicate what they thought
mm.
because they didn't put it in the way that actually makes sense to the local people.
Yeah,
Or
fascinating.
and often it's not. So people often get focused on the things of telling and they really don't know how to listen. In fact, this is one of my biggest problems with my learners is they keep making all these goals for being able to talk, but they haven't really made good goals for listening. And if they want to
Fascinating.
do if they want to do real communication, they have to learn to listen. And one of the things I've kind of realized, if you don't listen well in your first language, you're not going to listen well in your second language.
And I suppose to judge that, you'd have to ask your friends or maybe your spouse, just perhaps a little bit raw, how well do you think I am at listening in my, how good am I at listening in my first language? That's quite something to consider. Well, Leslie, I'm conscious that we're nearly at 20 minutes, and I do try to keep these episodes short. I have so many more questions for you, and obviously we haven't gotten to specific techniques for the different levels and things like that. So, we could sort of talk for hours and hours. So I think we'll probably need to have another couple of episodes, talking about some of the specifics of what's useful for different people, different environments, different levels, and that sort of thing. Um,
Absolutely.
are there any other further, final comments you want to make just in terms of the general idea about what self-directed language learning is and the role of a coach in that?
Yes. Basically, the coach is there to encourage the self-directed learner to find their way. The coach is there to help inspire confidence and guide them, but based on what the learner sees as important.
Mm-hmm.
Because the learner in the end is the one in charge. And as I was saying to somebody this weekend, the coach's goal is to help the learner become more and the coach become less.
Fantastic. I love it. I love it. Well, thank you so much for your time, Leslie.
You're
Now,
welcome.
if people would like to get in touch with you and see whether or not your services would be useful to them, they can do that through the Language Fuel website. I've got a contact box, and we can certainly pass those messages on. Well, thank you so much for your time. It's fascinating chatting with you, and no doubt we'll have a few further episodes where we can get into some of the nitty gritty. So thanks so much.
Absolutely. You're welcome. See you
All right.
later.
See ya.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Language Fuel podcast. You can navigate to the show notes and links via our homepage at www.languagefuel.com. See you next time.